Hey students, this is your Professor Emilianchuk, and today we're talking about day 24, and we're going to take a skeptical look at the assertion the definition of death is not a matter of biology. Right? So we looked at arguments on day 23 that were all about the idea that the definition of death is value laden, right? That our values about like what makes human life significant and how our death behaviors about grieving and when we can use somebody to like for organ transplant enter into our ideas about when someone is dead, right? And so we got into all kinds of stuff which I'll review here, but the thing I want to start off with, just really belaboring in our review, are these four levels of abstraction. These are really important to understand because they sometimes these things get conflated. Right? There's sort of like our death concept, right? It's really abstract and philosophical, a way of defining death. And then we have like our physiological criteria that direct clinicians to say, okay, you can look here, you can look there. And then we have some operational criteria and tests of irreversibility that they can deploy in order to then declare death, right? So you have like definition, right? Empirically determinal criteria that are like empirically detectable, and then the things that you can use to justify your declaration, right? Like those three Ds: definition, detectability, and then declaration basis, right? Those are the kind of three things that you kind of have to kind of remember, and they are captured here in these four criteria. All right, and so it's important to understand those things. And we also talked about just the history of how brain death became at least thought of as a biological indicator of death, right? It was spelled out in this President's Commission report, which undergirded and justified the Uniform Declaration of Death Act in 1981, where you could determine death either by like circulatory criteria or brain criteria, or what I call neurological criteria sometimes. Those are two ways. Those are two empirically detectable avenues or windows into our death concept. And the death concept that they adopted for the law was this: that death is the collapse of the integrated functioning of the organism as a whole. All right. We also talked a little bit about Robert Veitch and his skepticism of that idea. He thought the whole idea of whole brain death is absurd. He always thinks that you can find some function somewhere in the brain. All right. Like maybe the hypothalamus is kicking around, or maybe there's some pituitary gland secretions or some residual neurons firing away. He just thinks, you can't determine that, right? That's absurd. And so he just doesn't think that this criteria here is going to do the job for that. And he also thinks that death is just related to too many values, right? Our grieving and life insurance policies, marital policies, things that have to do with the transplantation of organs, right? Veitch is an advocate of what's called the dead donor rule. That means that you don't harvest everybody's all their vital organs from some body that's alive, right? You just don't want to do that, right? That's an act of killing in his view, and he thinks that's off limits. That's one of the Veitch's commitments. And so he thinks, well, look, if somebody just gets to a state where they're an organ donor, right, then they're dead. And so he has a very value-laden approach, and he advocates, which I think is fair. If you were to read all of his writings, you would get this kind of argument, what I call the beyond biology argument. And that's just the idea, right, that the definition of death can only be settled by like value-laden philosophical issues that go beyond the biological sciences. And if that's the case, then people are entitled to an autonomous choice among plausible definitions of death that they could like write down in some advanced directive and say, hey, let's say by like higher brain criteria, if I go permanently unconscious, you can declare me dead, you can declare me dead, and you can take my organs. Or maybe you want a little stronger one, so you have to not only test for loss of consciousness, but also loss of breathing. And so you can be declared dead by that criteria if you wanted. Or if you wanted to be like Jahai McMath's mother, you say, none of this brain stuff matters. What matters is the heartbeat and circulation. And so all these things, right, have to be a part of our death story or our death theory here. All right, so that's kind of what we talked about last time. We talked. We don't really talk. It's just me talking in these stupid YouTube videos. But here you go. Right, that's what I tried to at least communicate in the last lecture. Hopefully, it made sense. And today, we want to get into why there might be a good biological rationale for brain death, right? A good biological rationale for brain death, right? So it's not just about like losing personhood or consciousness. It has to do with our organismic life, okay? Now, there's been some skepticism of the idea that brain death indicates the loss of the integrated functioning of the organism as a whole. Remember, that was the rationale here that the Reagan's President's Commission assumed. That's how you define death at the philosophical level, all right? And so there was this amazing and very important scientist from UCLA named Alan Schumann. And he, if you read anything about brain death at all, you got to read Schumann. He is sort of like the 400-pound gorilla you got to wrestle with if you are going to defend brain death as a biological indicator of death. He is very, very skeptical of that. And he wrote in a series of papers starting in 1997 and really culminating in this one in 2001. This is the one I recommend reading. It'll really summarize his view really, really well. But he just kind of, he went through all these very interesting cases that were unusual, where brain dead bodies just persisted onwards for years, in some cases decades, right? You had like a family member, like in one case, whose kid exemplified brain death criteria at the age of 4, right? He had meningitis. And so the family, though, didn't withdraw life support. They kept him on it. They kept him on a feeding tube, and they just took care of him for like 20 years, right? The name is TK. That's the initials. And this body exhibited all sorts of different things, right? Homeostasis, right? You biology majors know what that means. Expelling cellular waste, right? Some energy balance, okay? His body would fight infections, right? If you gave the body some antibiotics with a needle, right? The wound would heal, right? The body went through puberty. Now, it also went through some proportional growth. Now, in the case of TK was a male, but there are female bodies that have been brain dead that have had a live fetus inside of them that have gestated to the point where they could do a cesarean section and remove it and have. So here you have, right, somebody who's declared dead giving birth. Okay, and so you just might think, well, goodness, right? If your body can do all these things after brain death, then this right here is not satisfied. See what I mean? Like the collapse of the integrated functioning of the organism as a whole, you know what? It's possible to survive brain death. And that was Schumann's main point. Okay? He just didn't think that brain death could physically indicate death. Right? He didn't care so much about personhood or any of that stuff. In fact, Schumann is a Roman Catholic, right? He doesn't really, and you know, if you read all of his writings, at one point he did advocate a higher brain view, but then he changed his mind. He has a very interesting evolution on this topic. So if you get into this topic, you have to read Schumann. He's super interesting. But he just kind of like brought forth all this evidence against the idea that brain death is death. Okay, so he causes such a stir that President Bush's Council on Bioethics feels that they have a need to respond. All right, and this is also a really wonderful piece. Now, I know it's kind of long, and you see it's 168 pages there, but this will, if you want a summary of the whole issue and the debate over this stuff, it doesn't really get much better than this. This is really, really well written. All right. And so what it does effectively is that after surveying the whole debate between Schumann and his detractors, is that they end up rejecting President Reagan's President's Commission's idea that the integrative unity of the organism as a whole is the right concept that we should be using to define death. So this is a pretty important change, right? This right here up here gets rejected by Bush's President's Council. Like, that is no longer any good. All right? Well, at least in one interpretation. That's in position 2, which we'll talk about. You could actually hold on to this. They don't go so far as to say that this is wrong, right? But they do say that rejecting it is reasonable. Okay? So that's what I want to say, right? Rejecting it is reasonable, and holding on to it is reasonable. So if you hold on to it, right, like Schumann does hold on to it, all right, then our current neurological criteria are just totally unsound, right? So that's position 1 in the paper. Now, I didn't have you read that, right? I just want to explain this as background, all right? You could adopt position 1. You could say, you know what? The integrative rationality that Schumann is talking about here, and he has all these counterexamples that he's coming up with, that's so much the worse for brain death. It's not death. Okay, so if you diagnose somebody as brain dead, you cannot determine that they're dead, right? From a biological point of view. Things are just too uncertain, okay? Now, you could withdraw life support, of course. That's all right. They're not offering some kind of sanctity of life view where you have to, like, keep these people on life support at all costs. It's not that at all. They say, you could still withdraw life support. They do think, though, that you could not procure organs from a brain-dead body. Now, that would have to stop because the President's Council does hold to what's called the dead donor rule. And that rule basically says that transplant surgery should not cause the death or kill the patient, right, in order to get organs, right? So that is held by the President's Council here. And so you'd have to switch to a kind of cardiac procedure, right, where you declare death on circulatory criteria, and then you start removing organs. And there's a whole procedure for doing that. I'm not going to go into that. But the brain-dead body would no longer be a source of organs on this view, okay? But they do think, from a policy perspective, it is reasonable to adopt that view. All right, so that's background. I didn't have you read that. But the part that I did have you read was their defense of position 2. And this is where they revise the philosophical concept, right? Where they say, this is right here, no good, we'll get rid of it, right? We're going to advocate something else, right? And that is what is called the vital work criteria. Okay, the vital work criteria, well, it kind of goes like this, right? An organism as a whole is present if it is performing its vital work. Okay, that's the big idea. And that is the work of self-preservation, achieved through the organism's need-driven commerce with the surrounding world. Right, so this is kind of a weird idea, right? But an organism as a whole exists if and only if, right, you have something that has some sort of openness to the world. So in the case of the human being, right, you're going to have some kind of perception of the world. Now, it might be the highest level perception that you and I have right now as, mature, healthy human adults, all right? Or it could be something that's diminished, okay, greatly. It could be like somebody who is like in a permanent vegetative state, right? Who can still kind of respond, right, to light, and it has a sleep-wake cycle, right? And these kinds of things. The ability to act on the world, okay? You have to be able to sort of engage with the environment, respond to the environment, and then the felt need to act in order to satisfy your needs. Okay, those are like the three fundamental capacities that underlie the vital work. And in human beings, right, especially postnatal human beings, these are signified in two ways. Our consciousness, which can be defined in terms of awareness or arousal. So remember how I made that distinction in the last lecture, right? So if you can be aroused, like you can be in a persistent vegetative state, well, then you exhibit a sign of consciousness. Now, it's not like the full-bodied consciousness, the kind that we care about, right? Awareness, but it is something that you could point to and say, we have a living being here. We have an organism as a whole. The other thing you could look to is a drive to breathe, right? Here, this is the drive to act on the environment, right? To take in air in order to fill the lungs, to get what you need, right? Oxygen is like our greatest need as a creature, right? So water, is like second, and food is third. But in order to live for the next 15 minutes, right, you gotta have air, all right? You just gotta have it. And even 15 minutes, that's a long time. I mean, it could be even shorter than that, all right? You gotta have air. So the central argument for accepting position 2, which is a sound biological justification for brain death, goes like this. Premise 1. If there are no signs of consciousness in terms of awareness and arousal, and if the spontaneous drive to breathe, which could be measured in brainstem activity, is absent, and if the best clinical judgment determines that these facts cannot be reversed, then we can say, or at least we can determine, that there's no more organism as a whole present. Right? So maybe I should revise this. Then all right. Satisfying criteria for total brain failure, and that's what they call brain death. They actually think whole brain death is not a very good description. They think it's too anatomical, and this is why Veitch is always sort of like, well, hey, look at these cells. They think, well, actually, what we want to do is measure the clinical condition, right? Which is there consciousness? No. Is there any kind of spontaneous drive to breathe that is governed by the brainstem? No. Okay, so then that is a total brain failure state, right? If you have that, then that satisfies the conditions up here, all right? That satisfies the conditions up here. And if there is no more organism as a whole, right, then death should be declared, right? And that's just kind of like, if we can say, there's some good grammar. All right. So that's just it, right? If you can kind of determine that this is the case, and if total brain criteria are satisfied, then death should be declared, right? That's the argument, right? That's the argument. So I want you to think about that, right? Is that correct? Does that kind of capture something about our nature as organisms, right? We have a conscious openness to the world, right? That's responding to it. And then we have this drive that is sort of directed to getting from the environment what we need. And if those things are gone, you have no organism there, right? So all this stuff up here, right? This stuff doesn't matter that much, right? Now that's kind of hard to buy, I realize. That's wait a second though. It sort of seems like there is all kinds of responsiveness going on here. And there's it seems like you have some real integrated functioning, and there's a kind of need commerce exchange going on here with the world, right? Especially with like expelling waste and homeostasis. What's going on with that? Okay. And what about this? Well, we enter into Burnat's argument. Okay. And he also focuses in and zeroes in on this concept, the organism as a whole. All right, the organism as a whole. And he thinks, right, that this idea is really important. The organism as a whole is greater than its organ system parts, right? So we're not just we're not just the sum of our parts. Okay, we're not just the sum of our parts. The organism as a whole is something that organizes the parts into a coordinated thing that acts for one purpose. All right? And it has such a powerful effect on our organization as a integrated being, right? It gives rise to what he calls emergent functions. So consciousness is usually like the paradigm example of what's called an emergent function. So if you think of the brain and all of its activity, all of its neurons working together, some way, somehow, and this is controversial for those who really believe a soul is at work here, but you might think that consciousness, with its just unified, very simple, outward-looking focus and experience, it's so different from anything like matter or that we study in physics. Our consciousness is just kind of an emergent function of the brain's activity, right? That's like a view of like the mind. It's just sort of like our conscious experience is an emergent function, right? That is kind of globally processing and working that arises out of the brain's biological workings, right? This is really vague and hard to describe, right? But that is sort of the idea. It's like these functions just emerge out of a coordinated functioning of underlying workings of the brain. And these things help to regulate breathing, circulation, right? And other irreplaceable functions of our conscious experience, like remembering stuff, right? Or recognizing speech or all this kind of stuff, right? And the part of his argument that I think is really interesting is that he draws an analogy between decapitation, okay, and the total loss of brain function. So here's the idea, okay, is that even if you could put a decapitated body on life support and produce these 8 outcomes above, so think of a headless body that somehow like got its blood circulating through it. You somehow keep it alive, just like all kinds of sophisticated medical technology. Well, you could produce homeostasis in that body. Or this too, right? Or this, or this, or this. And it just goes on, right? Now, maybe this is a little more controversial, right? But there have been some animal experiments. In fact, there's one that was done in Israel, right, where a lamb, or not a lamb, a sheep was about to give birth to a lamb, and the scientists, I know this is going to be gruesome for some of you, but they severed the head off of the sheep, but they kept its blood flow going, and they put it on life support, and the body a few hours later was able to deliver the lamb, right? And so whether or not that shows you could do this in a human being, and I hope no one ever tries that experiment, let me be clear. Okay, that would be just utterly grotesque and awful. All right, wicked, horrible, worthy of condemnation. All right, the idea here, the thought experiment that I'm trying to get you to like at least engage in, is that all these things could be present in a headless body. All right, a decapitated body. Excuse me. All right, I'm right here. And so if that's the case, it's obvious that those things are not definitive signs of life, because a decapitated body is a dead body. All right, it's a dead body. And so brain death, right, is a kind of physiological decapitation, right? So you don't have like two separate parts, obviously, right, that are spatially located, but what you have is something like this very, very important organ, right? The whole of our brain. Suppose that just completely fails. Well, we're not that much different then than somebody who's been decapitated, right? And there's somebody who made this argument long ago, who's got all kinds of pictures that are pretty interesting. Christopher Palace. He's mentioned in the reading, right? He advocates something called brain stem death. And he just thinks that if the brain stem fails, well, then conscious awareness fails, and so does your breathing, and so you're dead. And so in Britain, they can determine you dead on the basis of the death of the brain stem. And so he had made that argument in this big long paper. He's got pictures of decapitated bodies. And he's like, hey, look, the heart's still pumping here. And, you know, but it would be absurd to say, well, they got to be declared dead when their heart stops. It's like, no, they're dead. See, their head's gone. Again, I realize this is kind of grotesque, but, you know, you might think, well, yeah, that's pretty obvious, all right? And so there's other thought experiments as well, right? There's like chickens that can run around even if their head is cut off. Well, are they still alive? Well, no, because you no longer have an organism as a whole, right? You just have an organism as a very large part, which is no organism at all. Okay, that's not the same thing anymore. The thing is dead, right? It has no more head. It's dead. And so the idea is that brain death is good enough to capture something like that. All right, and so the idea then is that personal choice and autonomy and values play no part in the definition of death, only the discipline of biology. However, it is a philosophically robust sense of biology, right? This organism as a whole, with its emergent functions that are kind of weird and spooky, okay? You might think, all right, well, if you can buy into that stuff, then yeah, this turns out to be true. All right. So one objection, though, is what about the reasonableness of position 1, where we just reject neurological criteria for death altogether? And I want you to recall the case of Jahi McMath, right? Her mother believed that death was biological, all right, but she rejected neurological criteria, right? Her heart had to stop beating, right? There she is in the hospital bed. She's warm to the touch. Come on. You know, she's not dead. Her heart's got to stop. And so you still might think that on this view, people should have some sort of liberty to at least decide between whole brain criteria and cardiopulmonary criteria. Maybe not higher brain criteria. That's too psychological. Okay. But at least these two, you think you could choose. But McMath and her mom were not allowed to choose. Right? So you still might have an autonomy claim here. Okay, I want you to think about that. So for questions for discussion, they involve basically that question that I was just getting into. All right. But let me ask you this. Do you think the case for the biological justification for brain death succeeds? Or do you agree with Peter Singer, who was quoted in the Aviv article that I had you read for day 23, that brain death is not a sign of death, but an ethical choice masquerading as medical fact, right? Do you still think that's the case in light of the President Commission's and Burnat's case here, right? Should people still be able to have a right to choose whether to be declared dead on the basis of brain death or not? Okay, if you think so, do you think that brain dead patients should have the right to be maintained on life support? And if you don't think we have the right to choose our definition of death, then how should we as a society to respond to those like Jahi McMath's mother who hold to position 1? Okay? And let's also assume, for question 3 here, for the sake of argument, that a living embryo is an organism as a whole. Remember how we talked about the organism as a whole, and we talked about the embryo, right, in day 22? And is that a counterexample to position 2's concept of an organism? All right? Why or why not? All right, so that is the case for thinking that there is a sound biological justification for brain death, and that the definition of death is not a matter of biology, right? And so if you have questions about this, please let me know. I have lots to say about this. Again, I've written about this extensively. I know too much. I should also disclose at this point that I have argued in favor of position 2 in writing, right? You can actually find this on the web where I have written. I have a journal article forthcoming in this. So I'd want to disclose that, okay? But I want to hear what you have to say, and I am very much open to your objections, right? And if you think differently from me, that does not at all affect your grade. I think it would be awesome to hear your pushback. All right. So that is all I have to say. And like I said, ask me questions in email or over the Canvas page discussion thing. And I will talk to you later.